we've never had a superhero before this point who was sort of traumatized and depressed. That was completely different from any other superhero that had ever been done before. I don't think that was necessarily like a commentary on superhero comics, for instance, but I think it was definitely a commentary on America and sort of the end of childhood.
Comics Farm and Dave, snappy conversations with your hosts George and Jeff. Oh, classic comics, the classic comics Farm and Dave, talking about old comic books is the thing that they love the best.
It's the CCF in depth.
Hi everybody, I'm George. How you doing?
Hi everybody, I'm Jeff. How are you double doing? And we have a special guest with us today, Scott Harris King. Please say hello.
Hello. How are you triple doing, I suppose?
Nicely done. Today's episode, we are talking about how Avengers number 4 changed everything. This is our very first episode with this kind of scope. We've done entire eras before. We've done entire careers before. We've done 12-issue, year-long maxi series that changed the universe. But focusing on one specific issue? I don't know. Avengers number 4 might be the biggest game changer I can think of. George will say I'm exaggerating too much. But I think we all feel this is a very special, important issue. And we brought Scott Harris King on today, who is, if you don't already know, this is actually a really big moment for us in terms of that too, because this is like a Captain Kirk meeting Captain Picard, or the Captain Picards, because Scott Harris King created the original podcast for the Classic Comics Forum, and was gracious enough to let us take over when other projects came his way, because Scott Harris King is also the creator, the writer, sometimes artist, and publisher of the Crime Busters, Quest, and also Cthulhu versus Uncle Sam. Am I missing any, Scott?
Well, it depends on when people are listening to this, because I've also got a new romance comic I'm doing called Geek Love that'll be out hopefully in June or July of this year.
Hold on, I got to get that one.
I was just thinking, like, I will go without food for Geek Love number 1. That's amazing. But Scott has graciously taken time out of his impossible schedule to join us, because Scott is a massive Avengers fan. He's a great friend of ours, and I'm just excited to get all three of us in the room. Wait a second, forget Captain Kirk and Captain Picard. This is kind of Captain America meeting the Avengers, isn't it?
Actually, I was thinking it's more like the Flash of two worlds. On one side, Scott is running, and the other side, you're running. And I'm like the wall or something.
Well, then
you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, that works. So I'll be all the Avengers, and you'll be a wall. That's a good deal. I like that. So anyway, so Scott, we are so happy to have you here today. This is historic. This is big, and let's just start with very, very simply, Avengers number 4. I don't think any of us were around collecting and reading comics when that issue hit stands in 1964. I'd love to hear your stories about how you first came across that issue and what your first thoughts were upon reading it for the first time.
Well, I've been thinking a lot about this, and the first time I read it was actually, I bought a copy of Avengers number 4. So I read, the first time I read it was reading an original copy of it. Now, I don't know if I even knew the significance of the issue at the time. I've mentioned this, I guess, a few times in various places, but I started reading comics in 1984. Really got into comics quickly. So by 86, I was starting to collect back issues. And what I wanted was the oldest comics that I could get. I didn't really know that much about them. But I always loved old stuff, and so we started going to comic stores. The first back issue that I got was Avengers 36. And then shortly after that, we went to a comic store in Fitchburg, Mass, For those who may remember, it's called Same Bat Channel. It's not there anymore. And
It's no longer the Same Bat Channel anymore.
I went over. I wanted to see what they had for the old back issues, and what they had was an Avengers number 4. It was really, really beat up. It was $12.50, and the other old back issue they had there was issue 60. And so we got those 2 issues. My dad bought me the Avengers 4 because I didn't have $12.50, but my dad bought it for me. And we went home. It was falling apart, like a lot of spine damage. And so we did what any red-blooded comic book collector would do.
Oh, no.
Is we rubber cemented the spine to the comic to make sure it wouldn't fall off. And like that's how early it was in my comic collecting. That seemed like a totally fine thing to do, and then I read it. I think I read it first, and then I was like, oh no, the cover's falling off. If I keep reading it, it's gonna fall apart. So my dad was like, no problem, check this out. Glue, 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 glue.
It's a good thing you didn't have duct tape back then.
So that's my story. That's how I encountered Avengers 4. Is I bought it and I read it, and like I said, I don't know if I even knew the significance when I bought it. It was just like the oldest thing they had.
What was your take on it reading it for the first time? Did it seem special or different at all to you?
I mean, I don't... To be honest, the only thing I remember about it, because this was, in 1986, so it was almost 40 years ago. And
Still processing how you got it for $12.50 in 1986. Right. That's blowing my mind, by the way.
I remember thinking it wasn't very good.
Blasphemy, I say! Blasphemy!
Well, we'll talk about that. We're going to get into when we get into the story. But, I think I had some sense just from the cover, that it was really important. And the price, $12.50 doesn't seem like very much for that issue, but it was really beat up. I may have had some inkling because that was right around the time I started buying like books about back issues. I got my first like price guide in 1986. So that summer. So it was like I might have had some idea that it was important. I just didn't really understand it, It was better than Avengers 36. I mentioned that was the first back issue I ever got, and I traded that away like 2 weeks later because it was not good. But Avengers
That's
4,
blasphemy too. I love the Avengers. Get out of here. They were all great. Every issue. I
mean,
don't care.
That was 36.
Every issue of the Avengers, George. Every issue.
Well, the first 200 or so. All right, the first 300.
36.
Okay, the whole series. The whole series.
It's the first. 36 is the first issue Roy Thomas did, and it took him a while writing before he got good.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that's my experience with Avengers 4.
For the Avengers, it might have taken him about 40 issues, Scott. So, George, can we agree that we're going to do a whole episode on Avengers number 200 next, then, if they're all good?
Well,
you can count me out of that one.
Don't mention to me who wrote it, okay? Please. I'll walk out right now.
I want Captain Marvel dead. I want to see... No, forget it. Essentially, you bought it, you knew it was old, but it didn't resonate for you in that time period. So was there a point later on where suddenly you revisited the issue and you understood it differently, Scott? Or how did your evolution of understanding with Avengers number 4 progress, so to speak?
Well, relatively early on in my collecting, I was all over the place. I had a bunch of different titles. Like, I was buying everything new that I could get. And I was sort of all over the place. I was very unfocused. And my father said to me, he was like, and I wanted everything. So he said, what you should do is pick one title to focus on. And when you finish that, then you can move on to the next one. And I said, I'm going to go with Avengers. So then I started putting together a complete run of Avengers. And it wasn't too long after that I started to really have a different understanding of what issue 4 was. The more I got into Avengers as a series, the more I sort of understood the importance of it. And then we'll talk more about this later. I think the importance of Avengers 4 has gotten more as time has progressed. It's become more and more and more important, and so my understanding now of Avengers 4 is different even from when I realized how important it was as a kid, because I think it's more important now than it was in the 80s.
I would agree with that.
So, yeah, but once I really started focusing on Avengers, I started understanding the different keys, like what issue 16 was and how important issue 16 was, but also issue 4, like, it pretty quickly jumped out as like the importance of it was registered with me.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense. And I'm excited to hear more about your explanation later on for why it matters more today. I have my own thoughts about that, too. It's going to be a good one. George, do you want to go next and see if you can possibly work Mort Weisinger into the story somehow?
No, that's a good one, Jeff. That's a real good one. I'm going to say this.
I want to hear what you call him this time.
I don't even like to think about him, but you're right about one thing. When he had the funeral, they said his brother was worse. I thought you made that up, but they actually said
it's
that.
real. It's real.
Well, my first contact with Avengers number 4 was actually the reprint in Avengers Annual number 3, and it has a nice John Buscema cover. But when you open it up, Marvel comic books, they did something different with the way they formatted their comic books. They didn't. The first page, that splash page, usually was part of the story. DC was more like they would give you like a second cover on the first page, right?
And then they'd repeat that page a third time later on too. It was insane.
So I didn't like that too much. But they have a scene in Avengers number 4 where the Avengers, Thor, Iron Man, Wasp, Giant Man, they're lined up, and Captain America's marching towards them. And
Step forward, Captain America. Your rightful place is here, among the Avengers.
It's awesome. But the part that made me laugh is that right in the bottom, it says, editor's note, we sincerely suggest you save this issue. We feel you will treasure it in the time to come. So I'm like, boy, I know that Stan Lee was like a used car salesman, but boy, did he nail it there.
You say every issue's an instant collector's item, you're going to be right at least once, right?
But you will treasure it into time to come, and it's true. This, the book introducing Captain America, and again, we'll get into it, like Scott said, but there's just so many things about this issue that jump out at you, and I believe it might be one of the pivotal comic books in all of Marvel. Because they introduced somebody. Than that. Yeah, you can argue a lot of the Fantastic Four books are more pivotal, but this one, for some reason, they introduced somebody that sort of takes over. Like everybody looks to him after that, and he just walks in on issue 4. But he's like the perennial leader from that point forward, which was nice. Again, I Captain America I knew about before I read this. But I didn't understand, what he meant to everybody else, because they have a scene in the book where he's walking around New York and people are seeing him and they're going, "Is that really Captain America?" And there's an actual cop that starts crying because he's saying, "I can't believe you're here. When the world needs you the most." So he was important to the universe before this book. They actually introduced him, but he was like this folk hero. And he's back, when people need him. It's a great book. Just a great moment.
Yeah. I guess I inevitably had to approach it differently being a child of the 1980s. And I can't await George's comments numerous times teasing me for that in this episode. I'm sure it's coming. But, for me, in the 1980s, comics had moved far away from being for kids. I've mentioned that several times. But what had taken place was comic book companies were merchandising way more effectively than they had in the past. So my first experiences with Captain America had nothing to do with comic books. When I was, I think, like 3 years old, for Christmas, one of my presents was a play school wooden puzzle of Captain America standing in an arena. And I'd never heard of the character before, but I sat there and I put that puzzle together, and it actually gave me time to focus on and think about, who is this guy whose smile tells you he has all the answers? So I tucked it away in my head, and then the Secret Wars action figures came out, and Captain America was there, and he was important. And, it wasn't really ever out of my understanding of Marvel Comics that Captain America was centrally important. I didn't really know much about who he was, but I put him on the same level as Superman and Batman. I knew he mattered. And, then back in 1990, the Marvel Universe Series 1 trading cards came out, which, for kids was the hugest thing. Those cards are still the coolest thing ever. And Captain America was the very first card. He was card number 1. So if you put your binder, if you set your cards up in order, he was the first thing you saw. And at the very back, one of the coolest things they did in that set is they had these iconic covers, these iconic issues, the most collectible Marvel comics that kids like me didn't know about. It was a good crash course. Hulk 181 and Fantastic Four number 1, and there was Avengers number 4. And just that cover alone, it was the most beautiful, interesting one of all the cards from that little section to look at. So it was always sort of ingrained in my head, and honestly, I think I thought it was Avengers number 1, because the idea that Captain America wasn't always an Avenger didn't seem possible to me. But finally, it was
that's a better cover.
Later.
That's a better cover than number 1.
Oh my God, yes. Well, we might talk more in a moment about why Avengers number 1 might have been a rush job. There's a whole theory on that one. But anyway, the point being that when 1991, I'm into comic books now. I'm reading them as an 11-year-old kid. And Avengers in the early 1990s was off of the grid of kids my age. There were enough Avengers titles. Somebody must have still been reading them. Avengers West Coast, Wonder Man, Quasar. Captain America had his own comic, of course. But nobody was really talking about them. There was no hype about them. So I was, collecting every X book I possibly could and all the Spider-Man titles, That was 12, 13 books right there. Avengers just was never something I'd gotten around to. And then they had Operation Galactic Storm, which was this massive crossover using all the Avengers titles. And you kind of had to pay attention. It was ambitious. And I can tell you honestly, years later, I have zero memory of anything that happens in that story. It's this epically long thing that just did not impress me in the least bit. But I think also at that point where the comic book market was, if you were in the mainstream and a kid, a lot of the quality of the stories and kind of Marvel was not really in its heyday anymore. The sales were there, but it wasn't putting out its best stuff. Instead, I think it's safe to say I was more of a collector. I was buying the comics to own them, and I kind of felt like it was my duty to read them first, but I rarely ever actually enjoyed them. I enjoyed the thrill of the purchase more than the read. But I remember Captain America number 400 was part of Operation Galactic Storm. And the lead story was whatever. I have no idea what happened. But because it was a big anniversary issue, they threw in some extra content in the back. And I know they did this with the Hulk anniversary issue that year too, and a couple others as well, where they threw in all this extra content, including a reprint of the first story that character had ever been in. Or in this case, for Captain America, it was Avengers number 4. And the funny part for me was, I had the exact opposite reaction of young Scott. Comics generally didn't excite me that much other than the covers and owning them. And I'm reading this comic, and I'm like, yeah, whatever, I guess I kind of know what's going on, okay, Supreme Intelligence, Shi'ar Empire, yada, yada, yada. And I get to the Avengers number 4 reprint, and I'm like, well, this looks different. This looks kind of stupid, because, it's old art, I'm not that used to it. But then I actually, something about the art compelled me. It was my first real introduction to Kirby, who on some levels looks primitive, compared to art that came afterwards, but on the other hand is so dynamic and interesting. I read it, and I remember being completely and totally enthralled with it. Even though it's scientifically completely impossible that a man frozen in ice can just thaw out in an ocean and be okay a minute later. I mean, my gosh, his eyeballs, that had to be a bad situation. But the idea was so cool. Oh my gosh, he's from a different era, and here he is. And Kirby's art utterly sold it and made Captain America look like such a badass. The poses and the postures were unforgettable. And I think the part that thrilled me the most was I didn't realize before this that he wasn't always an Avenger, but when he woke up, he was vulnerable. He wasn't a guy with all the answers. He was a guy out of time who had lost his best friend, who was in shock, who was grieving, who was depressed, but could put that mask on and become Captain America. And there was something about that. And it's never left me, and it's become more important to me as years go on. He was broken inside, but he could put that mask on and become Captain America. And Kirby's postures and facial expressions told you everything. And I've always loved that story ever since then. It took me years to actually get an original copy, but I knew right then and there it was magic. And I haven't read a lot of Captain America since, but I've always revered the character after reading that issue.
That's a great book. That page where he gets thawed out, and they're like in shock and saying, "Is this a mask of Captain America?" And they're like, "Look, he's alive." And like they ask him, "Are you Captain America?" And he says, he kind of gets up and puts on everything, and he just stands at attention and says, "Here I am." It was just an awesome moment. I was like,
the
wow.
dude's been frozen in ice for 20 years, wakes up, realizes he just saw his best friend die, and within 6 panels puts the mask back on and gets it together. What the hell?
I mean, that's Silver Ace, goofiness, where somebody could be frozen for, what was it, 10 years or something?
20, I believe.
20 years, right? Something like that.
Yeah.
And no, he can move. All his joints are fine. He's like everything's just good, because he beats the Avengers up like in the next 2 panels, doing acrobatics and everything. And I'm like, okay, Silver Age.
And yet on a symbolic level, Kirby really sells it, where you see him in the first real thought out panel with the seaweed dangling all over him, looking totally helpless and destroyed. And you're like, there's no way there's life left in that body. And a page later, he is up and straight and rigid, and a page after that, he's in perfect form, dodging Mjolnir and all these amazing things they're throwing at him. The whole point of this was, here's a guy that no matter what setback you throw at him is going to be a badass at the end of the day, because that's what he does.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I guess we're already kind of going there. How about the story itself? Moving historical context, nostalgia, your first experiences with the side. What are your impressions of what actually happens in this story?
Well, for me, there's kind of 2 different parts to this. There's some stuff in this story which you guys just been talking about, which is absolutely great. The part where Captain America wakes up, it's one of the most iconic scenes in all the comics. And for a reason. It's really powerful. I mean, everything with Captain America sort of in this issue is extremely powerful. When he comes out of the submarine after they get back to the city, and the Avengers aren't there, and so he's making his way around the city, and everyone's reacting to him and breaking down in tears because they're amazed that Captain America's returned. And then when he meets Rick Jones and he thinks it's Bucky.
Oh God, yes.
Everything with Captain America, the character moments with him are just great. Absolutely great. The rest of the story, the actual plot, where it turns out the Avengers have been turned into statues by an alien who was bribed by Namor to destroy the Avengers so that Namor will fix his spaceship, which is at the bottom of the ocean. And then the Avengers try and fix it for him instead, and Namor attacks them. That plot is absolutely stupid. And when I reread it yesterday, and I've read it many times, but I reread it again last night, and I thought to myself, this is really bad. It's a strange issue because the plot is really stupid, but it's also secondary to the character work, and the character work is incredible. So it's a very strange read, because it's 2 very different elements that don't really work together.
I have to say something about that. If you read this book, you'll see that it's pretty much just a Captain America story, and it's again it's a device to get him back into the continuity. And they had things happen to him in the 50s that they kind of fluffed over and didn't acknowledge. So they had to find a way to get the most popular version back in with the regular heroes now. And that's what it was. When you see they throw him, he shows his abilities, taking down Giant Man, and like talking smack in a sense, because like when he takes him down, he says, he said, "You are big, my friend, but in my day, I fought others who are bigger still, and I defeated them just as I shall defeat you now." And he does it, and he's beating his ass. So that's an introduction. Shows you, well, this guy's amazing. He has no powers or anything, and look what he's doing. So that is to introduce you to him again, give him a status quo, and see that he could take charge. Because even when he meets Rick Jones kind of thinks he's crazy, and then Captain America says, "Well, I'm gonna have to live in this world, and I'm gonna have to snap out of it, and and thank you for reminding me that there's still life to be done." And right away he starts ordering Rick Jones around, so you can see he's like a take charge guy. That's when you introduce to the leader aspect of Captain America, that he's trained for this. And again, a lot of the other plots, I have problems with it too. More the last time I read it, which was yesterday, I had a lot of problems with. But hold on, how did this happen and how did that happen? And I'm like, well, you can't pull on that string too much, because everything will unravel. Let's just say this is a way of introducing Captain America, who's maybe one of the most important figures in all of Marvel comic books, and he becomes that after this.
Yeah, I'm relieved. I was afraid we weren't going to have anything to disagree over this time, George, and you've finally given me something to work with. The one place I'm going to fight you, because I otherwise totally agree, is
you and me disagree? No way.
Never, not even once. It's never happened. But I think you stated that this is more of a Captain America comic than an Avengers comic, and I would actually argue this is the first Avengers comic. And the reason being that I read the first 8 issues last night, and the first 3 issues of the Avengers, and I hope I don't offend anyone here, they suck.
No, they didn't. They were great. They were great.
No,
that number 3 is a great book. Great.
They're not good. Book. Sorry, they're not good books.
Oh, yes, they are. Oh man, what's wrong? I guess you're not an Avengers fan anyway.
Well,
I love the Avengers. Those first 16 issues are great.
Give me issues 80 through 180, and we're good. I love that era. But anyway, hold on. But because I love number 4 as well, and I think it gets a lot better after number 4.
You got to jump in here because this guy's blaspheming again.
Well, I'm not quite sure what to say here, other than I'm a big Avengers fan. Well, I'll say 2 things. The first is, and I don't want to put words in anyone else's mouth, but I'm pretty sure that Kurt, the sort of grand poobah of the Classic Comics forum, has said before that he thinks Avengers number 1 through 5, a story which is sort of a complete story that concludes in Fantastic Four 25, is one of the best Marvel stories and one of his favorites. So I think that there's definitely a perspective to be had there on sort of the search for Hulk as a really good story for Marvel. Mm-hmm. I tend to agree with Jeff. I'm not a big fan of the first 15 issues of Avengers. I think it's a lot more interesting once Cap's Kooky Quartet comes into play with issue 16.
Those are great too.
I think the book, for me, I really like the Cap's Kooky Quartet era. I think the book gets better earlier than Jeff does. I think, Roy Thomas really hits his stride with issue 52. And there's a year there starting around issue 52 that's really awesome. But the first few issues of Avengers aren't that great for me. I tend to agree with Jeff. I think the book needs Captain America. The book, we'll talk more about this later, but not just the book. I would say the entire Marvel universe sort of is missing the center. Avengers specifically, Captain America becomes sort of the heart of the team. He becomes the heart of the comic book series.
Absolutely.
And the heart of the entire Marvel universe. And the first 3 issues of Avengers are just sort of like a collection of random strangers that are not as interesting as the people they're fighting against. When they're fighting like Loki, and they're fighting Namor, and they're fighting the Hulk, and it's just sort of like none of them have any personalities at this point in time. They get personalities later, but Thor has got no personality yet.
No way. I have to disagree. What's wrong with you guys? Are you reading the same book I'm reading? They all have their own separate personalities. Thor is a badass. When he comes in, he looks down on everybody, but he kind of finds the Avengers to be people that he can be equal with. I thought it was great, and when Captain America came along, it added a different dimension to the whole thing. But I thought before that, I mean, maybe the first issue, so-so. But the other ones... I mean, the way I see it is that you have these people that banded together, but the problem is the Hulk is not going to listen to anybody, so they're trying to keep him in line. And again, what you refer to Kurt saying that whole arc from the first 5 issues, concluding in Fantastic Four, is about them forming as a team. Because once they realize they can't have Hulk anymore, they don't need him. Now they have the regular, Cap and the other 4.
I'm going to revise my statement. I'm going to walk that back a bit, and I'm going to say issues 2 and 3, if you're looking in terms of conflict, are good stories. So let me revise what I meant to say and kind of agree mostly with Scott, a little bit with what you're saying too, George. But I'm going to piss George more off with this one, I'm sure. But it's true. This is empirically true. Okay, ready? In the first 3 issues, the Avengers are assholes. They're mean to each other.
They're learning to be a team.
It's more than that, though. They're petty. They nitpick each other over things, and they never, ever, ever actually work together. They each fight on their own in classic Justice League style. It ends up kind of working out, but there's no coordination. There's no teamwork. There's no trust. There's no mutual respect. And then in issue 4, right after Captain America gets off that table and pulls his whole, who am I? For a moment, I'd almost forgotten myself, but I'm freaking Captain America. That's when you see it all change. Then suddenly, like, only a few pages later, you've got Iron Man saying, "Nothing is hopeless to the Avengers, pal." And then you've got him saying to Thor, "It worked. You freed the ship, Thor." And Thor smugly goes, "Why do you sound surprised? Was that not my intention?" But also Kirby's got him smirking
I love that scene.
Yeah, Kirby's got him smirking like, "Thanks, dude." And then you've got Iron Man saying to Ant-Man, "Thanks, big fella. I'll handle a few that are left now. You better see how Thor's making out." And Ant-Man goes, "Will do, partner." And suddenly they're vibing as a team because they're not just fighting for themselves anymore. They're fighting for something larger because Captain America set an example, an expectation. This is what a hero is, and changes them after that point.
And if you look at the story, Captain America saves their ass.
Oh, yeah!
I mean, they're done. They got turned into stone. If Captain America wasn't there, they're gone.
Here, check this part out too. So in the second and third issues, when they're searching for the Hulk, part of what you see there that is both interesting and different. It's very Marvel, but also a little bit disconcerting is how mean they are to the Hulk. But then issue 4, after they've learned from Captain America and worked together, they're even freaking nice to Namor when he's threatening to kick their asses. Thor gives him an ultimatum, and Namor's like, "Nah, screw it, I'm going to kill you." And he goes, "Very well, Namor, let whatever befalls then be upon your own head." We gave you a chance, man. The chance we never gave to the Hulk, because we are now better people, because we've got Captain America.
Well, you said they were mean to the Hulk. I kind of think, they were kind of afraid of him. He's a loose cannon, one of the most powerful people in the Marvel Universe. They wanted to keep him in check. I mean, the second issue opens with him like in those shorts, and like I think his door saying, "What are you dressed like that for, man? Don't come in here with shorts on. What are you doing?" Like they don't respect him at all.
Yeah.
But I like the conflict.
But weirdly enough, that makes me like the Hulk more than I like the Avengers. And then he leaves, and we're stuck with them as the team we're supposed to follow.
That's a sad moment in the end of the second issue where when they all realized the Space Phantom was jerking them around and taking their appearances. It's really sad when you look at the Hulk and says, I didn't realize how much you guys hated me until now.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you feel pity for him at that point, and you're like, yeah, you're kind of right. And as he jumps off, the Avengers are going, well, now we're in trouble because he's gone, and who's going to control him now?
Yeah, I'm going to go a little bit further with that later on for my tinfoil hat theory, because it's really important. But I think one thing that might also be important to bring up here is only very recently an unconfirmed rumor came out that Avengers #1 was actually created at the last minute as a filler issue. Have you guys heard this story?
I think so, and if you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my memory tells me that they were supposed to be putting out Daredevil.
Yes.
And Daredevil was late, I think, because Wally Wood was late.
It was Bill Everett, actually.
Bill Everett, yeah.
It wasn't Wally Wood. Okay.
I was thinking of it because Wally Wood did issue 7. But yeah, so it was late, and so they had a space in the schedule they had to fill. And so they put together Avengers, which I think is funny because Avengers is just much better than Daredevil. And ended up being a much bigger success than Daredevil. But yeah, so I've heard that they kind of had to rush it out because Daredevil was so late.
Right, so they had these characters lying around. We'll throw them together, and I kind of think that's why the team doesn't have any kind of a center, and there's nothing to like about them as a unit until Captain America wanders in. I feel like they were a bit directionless in those first 3 issues.
It's funny. One of the origins of the Fantastic Four is that Stan Lee decided, Goodman told him to copy the Justice League. And he says, well, I want to do superheroes my way. And he did Fantastic Four. But the real copy of the Justice League was Avengers. Because there were people that had their own book already.
And yet you can
Fantastic
also
Four was totally unknown.
Yeah, and yet you can see that Lee and Kirby are both trying so hard to avoid making them feel like the Justice League. So, like, Stan Lee's constantly having them take digs at each other, which the Justice League would never do. And Kirby, I think because it makes for more dynamic poses and better visuals, has them constantly looking aggressive towards each other in the beginning, because that just makes for something better to look at. But as a result, what you end up with, and I know, Marvel's signature in the early days was having characters who are more flawed, who are more real. Gosh, I'm going to end up giving away too much of this early on. But I think, really, Captain America is the first time that you get a character who truly and wholesomely feels like somebody you want to look up to and emulate. Who just, his character right down to the bare bones matter is somebody who puts his duty above his feelings and is a true and legitimate hero.
I think they're all major heroes, and I think they all deserve respect. But I think when Captain America came along, his only identity was as an Avenger. So he became the natural default guy that was going to be in charge, or he was going to be the person bridging the gap between teams. Because at the end of issue 16, the original Avengers all go their separate ways and leave Captain America to take on the other 3 new ones. So he's a transitional person, but the other characters had their own books and had their own. I mean, they were all capable and major characters. So I don't really see it your way. But of course,
well, it's not me saying they weren't heroes and that they didn't save the day and do what was right. It's that whenever they would come across another hero, it was always a conflict of some kind. Even the Fantastic Four. I mean, the petty bickering was. If a real family did that in 2024, we'd call them toxic.
But that's what sold the book, though. I mean,
I agree with you. It's what made Marvel stand out for sure, but it also made it less heroic. I think you had really 2 characters in Marvel prior to Avengers #4 who I would feel comfortable calling heroes, and that would be Ben Grimm, who could just as easily be the most noble, altruistic hero possible as become an anti-hero on an almost Hulk-level rampage the next moment. And Spider-Man, who, in spite of the world constantly dogging him, kept pushing himself to do the right thing. And yet, interestingly enough, this is where I'm going way too far on this one, and I'm sure George is going to call me crazy on this one. But I think Ben Grimm in many ways was an avatar for Jack Kirby, who was a really good, noble guy who had a temper. And I think that Spider-Man was an avatar for Ditko, who was, very insecure and felt hounded by people and persecuted. And those were the two characters who felt heroic. And the rest they had powers, they did the right thing, but they didn't necessarily conduct themselves in a way that I considered admirable when they talked to each other. They were just brawlers, almost like Mexican wrestlers. They were on the right side, but they weren't really heroes. They were just doing the good work.
Well, I think that a hero, to me, you define a hero better when he's reluctant. He doesn't want to do something, but he does it because it's the right thing to do. That's what a lot of the Marvel comic books had. They had people that, they had to sacrifice something to do what they were doing. I mean, I guess Thor was the most. He had a code, because I'm doing reviews about these early Thor books, and you see, he's forbidden to kill human beings. He has a code. So
sure.
You just want to unleash, but you're not going to, because you have to hold yourself back. I understand what you're saying. But the flaws, and it's more human that somebody would say, well, I don't want to, save this person, but let me put my spider suit on anyway.
So I might as well go for it here. I'll go right into my tinfoil hat theory, because I think it's got to happen now.
Tinfoil hat theories.
Which is that if you look at the heroes that DC had been pumping out, the very people that Stan Lee and Kirby were trying to get away from, they were hollow. There was no meaning to them. They were post 1954 Wortham Comics Code goody good guys who supported the establishment and didn't actually stand for anything. They didn't make sacrifices. They didn't make hard decisions. They were upstanding and boring and dull and would never fight with each other. And then you've got these characters who are very real, and George, you're right. They sacrifice things. But their appeal to the reader was not as an emblem of goodness. It was an emblem of power, a fantasy. It was, wouldn't it be cool to have Thor's hammer and be able to smash things, or be Ant-Man and be able to become small and have ants work for you? It was less about the character. In fact, I think it took a while for Lee to figure out their personalities, and more about the costume and what they could do. And then Captain America comes in, and he is a whole different kind of hero that we'd never seen before. Because right from his first moments getting off that table, he has suffered more than probably any superhero that had ever seen print prior to that moment. And yet, within the span of 8 panels, gets himself together and becomes this figure of absolute duty. But the key is, he's not just, I pledge allegiance to the flag duty. He's about more than that. Everything about the way Kirby depicts him. My gosh, the panel when he's first being tested by the Avengers and Thor flings the hammer at him. The way in which Kirby has him dodge it with his legs completely straight and his one arm folded, almost like he's ready to give a salute, and the other arm straight to his side in perfect form after he'd just been at the bottom of an ocean for 20 years. The guy was willpower incarnate. He was a hero not because it was fun, not because it was some personal quest. It was a sense of duty to him. It meant more to him than just that. And if you look at what was happening in America at the time and why that was so important, Marvel's trying to appeal to slightly older readers, not just impressionable kids, but high schoolers and college kids who had big questions about the world. And the 1960s was a very uncertain time. We'd been in Vietnam for 9 years by the time this comic was made, and there were rumors of a draft, and people were worried about what patriotism was anymore, and could the government be trusted, and didn't it make any sense? McCarthyism had ended only a few years earlier. We'd seen, public officials absolutely do evil with their power, and people who are patriots succumb to evil things. Racial issues in America were first beginning to come to a brim. You had youth counterculture and teens trying to decide, I don't believe in the establishment, what do I believe in? And then right as this comic was being written, Kennedy is assassinated. That happened while this comic was being written. In fact, there's an anecdote about Stan Lee typing while it was announced. Captain America brought a new kind of heroism and a new kind of patriotism to the world at exactly the moment when the target audience needed a new example to learn from. And the Avengers learn from him, and they change, And I think the entire Marvel universe changes as a result. We start seeing these characters do more than just stop the bad guy. We see them struggle with real issues of ethics and what is right and what is wrong. And I think the world learns from Captain America. I think we start to see DC Comics slowly deal with interpersonal conflicts and things like that. But more importantly, the readers who are looking for something to believe in. And they couldn't find it in their politicians anymore. They found Captain America in Marvel Comics.
Well, if I could piggyback off that, because
Please.
I actually wanted to talk about something, basically the same thing, but a slightly different way. Because I agree that specifically the assassination of Kennedy is crucial, I think, to this story, to this new version of Captain America, and also to why this is so important and why the character is so important. The fact that this story was being written at when Kennedy was assassinated, I think what we see of the new Captain America in this issue is, for me, it reads like a direct response to the Kennedy assassination. I think it was super interesting that they decided to have Captain America frozen during World War II and thawed here. We haven't talked about it too much, but in the actual publishing history, Captain America, the series, did not end during World War II. It continued into the late 40s, and then there was a brief revival in the 50s. And so while
Captain America, Commie Smasher.
Exactly. But they jettisoned all that. And so it gives us the contrast between Captain America, the Captain America that you might have in your mind of a sort of jingoistic, national symbol of war, right? Of the good side. Like, this is the World War II figure who was the guy who, was doing the right thing during the good war for all of us. And then what happens is he wakes up and he's a totally different person. He's dealing with trauma. He's dealing with this pathos. He's depressed. He's wandering around looking at how the world has changed in 20 years. He doesn't recognize any of it. He doesn't understand how it's changed and how it is to this point. I think that's all a commentary on the way society had changed, but again, specifically with the assassination of Kennedy, I think we get this new version of Americans reflected here, where all of that hope after the war has sort of ended. We see in particular the scene where the police officer breaks down in tears when he sees Captain America, and he makes a comment about how he's so emotional because Captain America is who they need at this moment. And I think he's specifically talking about this moment being right after the death of Kennedy. I think a lot of what we see with Captain America in this story is a direct response to that national tragedy, and how it was the immediate response by the creative team, how they were feeling about things. But it also creates a new type of character in superhero comics. We've never had a superhero before this point who was sort of traumatized and depressed and sad. That was completely different from any other superhero that had ever been done before. And it also brand new and something that's incredibly modern, but I think again can be seen in some ways as a response to the situation with Kennedy, is the death of Bucky. DC at this point still has all these teen sidekicks. Not just Robin, but you have Kid Flash, who had just been introduced a few years earlier. You have Aqualad, who had just been introduced in 1960. You have Wonder Girl. You have all of these sort of teen sidekicks, which is a classic, of the superhero genre. And here we have what is really a shocking moment. It doesn't seem like now because it's so modern that it's this kind of thing that people do all the time now in comics. But imagine in 1964 where this teen sidekick who's supposed to be the avatar for the reader. This is the kids who are reading comics see themselves in the sidekicks, right? And what happens here is he gets blown up. The bad guy blows him up on a bomb and kills him. And that's, I don't want to get like too crazy with the symbolism, but it is sort of like the death of that sort of dream, that sort of like childish idea of what heroism was. And because now we're dealing with reality. Like now, post-Kennedy assassination, it's like that seems a little bit naive to think you can just like do that. And so I think like I don't think that was necessarily like a commentary on superhero comics, for instance, but I think it was definitely a commentary on America and sort of the end of childhood. And so like those things, like it's so different from anything that had ever been done in comics that it makes the character of Captain America mean something completely different for a whole new generation when he's revived in this issue.
That's
really
so
is
good.
An excellent point.
That's so good. Wow, Scott, you win.
Yeah, I tell you too. Just killing the teen sidekick probably was never done before that, and it totally wraps up the World War II Captain America.
Yeah, my mind keeps going
on from there.
My mind goes back to your point, Scott, about how he was the first hero to suffer trauma. And actually, when you think about it, he's the second, but he's the first to handle it in a healthy way. There's a huge compare-contrast in your theory to Batman, who experiences a childhood trauma and, is so fundamentally hurt by it that he changes his entire life and dedicates it towards vengeance. And Captain America's like, I just have to move on and do my job again. I don't need to be fundamentally changed by this or broken by this. I need to take a breather and get back into it. I failed to protect the most important responsibility I had. Now I have to focus on my next responsibility and set an example.
Just say, what was it about? You said something about Batman was the first one?
Batman was the... Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
The difference with that is that Batman was created out of that loss. That's the whole reason for him being is that his parents got killed right in front of him. So he's always been that character, and he's kind of never changed. With Captain America, he had this life in World War II. He was, fighting this war. He had Bucky on his side, and then the next thing you know, he wakes up, and everything is gone. The 20 years are gone. Bucky's gone. He has to he takes on that he was probably responsible and he should have saved them, and maybe even thinking this younger person was with me. I mean, look, Bucky was a kid and he lost them and couldn't save him, and he has to live with that PTSD. And also you say like he snaps out of it, but not really, because one of the criticisms of the Avengers book when the Kooky Quartet comes along is, and even before that, before they came along, is that Captain America every issue opens up kind of like being sad about Bucky. And like every issue it was something like, I lost Bucky, and what am I gonna do now? And so it wasn't like he just snapped out of it as okay, which I guess in a sense is more realistic anyway.
Yeah, I think we're actually agreeing. I would never for a second applaud a hero for snapping out of mental, health issues. That would be a very negative message. What I meant more by that is he snaps out of the self-pity.
Well, but again, he does do some self-pitying. But
my point being that
what makes a hero to me is that a person that you feel sad, but you still get up and go to work.
Well, that's my point, is that when something has to be done, he can do it. And then when he has time, he can fall apart. And then he can regather himself again. Whereas Batman becomes a symbol. I don't know if he becomes a symbol of it because his origin story kind of goes away pretty quickly. But, at least in that origin story. And by the way, keep in mind that his origin story was really fleshed out years after he was first created. But the idea being that his grief transformed him and he could never go back. Whereas Captain America is fundamentally changed. But he can still get up and go to work and set a good example for the people around him while working through his issues at the same time, which is a much healthier and much more noble example than Batman's. And to go full circle, in 1989, Batman loses his kid sidekick and becomes darker than ever and more unhinged. And now he can punch out Guy Gardner and be jaded and dark, and everybody loves it because, of course he will. Captain America didn't have to do all that.
Batman, he's been depicted as just a person that has like mental illness in a sense. He's walking around, he dresses up like a bat. I mean, he has a lot of anger, and he can never. That anger can never go away. See, with Captain America, he was always this positive guy that I'm going to do this. I'm going to take care. Even at the end of this issue, when he starts mixing it up, when Namor starts fighting the Avengers at the end, and Captain America jumps into it, Namor is going to break his neck, but Captain America says he's stronger than me, but I'll find a way to beat him.
Yep. Captain America is weaker than all the Avengers too. His powers are less impressive than each of theirs, but they're looking up to him with reverence by the example he sets.
Yeah, that's the difference. Like, he doesn't let something like Bucky dying stop him from being what he is. He's still a guy that's saying, "Look, we're going to find a way." I'm going to reference a Marvel Cinematic Universe, but in that last movie that he started, when they were all together, Endgame, right before they go into the time tunnel or whatever of the quantum world, he gives them a speech and he says, we don't know what to expect. We're going to go into this, but this is the fight of our lives, and we're going to win. And like when he says that, you see like Tony Stark looking at him like, wow, and he's saying, no matter what it takes, we're going to win. So that's the kind of guy you want with you. You want somebody who's going to say, well, I know that the army against us is tough, but we're going to win. Yeah. Everybody wants that. Captain America is the first guy to really exemplify that to that level.
He's 100% character. His superpower is his personality. Yeah. And I would even argue, and this is probably splitting, hairs, but I think it's important. I see Avengers #4 as Captain America's first real appearance. Before that, he was a ripoff of the Shield from MLJ. This is when he becomes a distinct, unique character never been seen before.
Okay, let's get into the origin, man. Let's get into the origin, because I got a couple of things to say.
All right, do it.
Well, from what my research says is that Goodman hired Joe Simon to create something to rival and to fight against Superman and those other characters. And he came up with a patriotic hero, but he wanted to call him Super Avenger, Super
American,
or something like that. Yeah,
I think.
And he didn't go with that, and it finally went with Captain America. This is what kind of I didn't know this. Jack Kirby had nothing to do with any of this. But
Depends on who you talk to. Huh? Depends on who you talk to.
Actually, I see it's a couple of different sources. They said that Joe Simon came up with the idea already. And when Jack Kirby came along, of course, he fleshed it out. He drew him the right way. And certainly, I mean, Joe Simon said later on, I give him, certainly he's co-creator. But Joe Simon was the one that came up with the idea first. So it's funny, I find it funny that everybody's always bashing Stan Lee, Jack Kirby created everything, and yet the character he's most associated with, Captain America, he really didn't create him. Joe Simon did.
Even if you want to accept that explanation, he's still a ripoff of the Shield. It's the same character.
Where's the Shield now?
Well, that has nothing to do with it. Where was Captain America prior to Avengers #4?
Well, I mean, Shield came out like a year before Captain America.
Yes.
But Captain America took off and started selling like million copies a month.
Sure,
I don't know the sales of the Shield.
I know the Shield was a very hot property for a long time. I don't know how long and I don't know how big.
I don't know about a long time. I never heard of him. I
Well,
guess what happened.
He was the headliner. He was the headliner in Pep Comics for a long time, past the emergence of Archie. I know that for sure.
Scott, you know anything about the Shield?
Yeah, I mean, his publication history was similar to a lot of Golden Age superheroes, where he was popular during the war. But, as the war was going along, Archie was also becoming more popular. So after the war, he sort of got edged out. He was still in Pep Comics, I think, for quite a while, even after Archie sort of took over the covers.
Yes.
So he was still in the book, but, in the sort of like post-war period when most superheroes were being phased out, he eventually got phased out as well. But, he was on the covers regularly up for a couple, 3 years or whatever after Archie first appeared.
I guess what I'm asking is, was he a contemporary with Captain America? And when they were going head to head, who was selling better?
That I don't know, but I do know that Captain America was a ripoff of the Shield. That much I can still maintain.
He might have been, except that he surpassed what the Shield was.
Do you know that?
I mean, he's still around and the Shield is not.
But that's due to Avengers number 4. That's my point. Is that
okay? Maybe.
Yeah, I think Avengers number 4 is the issue that really. And Captain America was huge. I'm not downplaying that. He was selling almost Superman levels in Sean Howe's words back in 1941. There were pins, there was a fan club and everything. But I really think Avengers number 4 is when that character becomes his own character and becomes who we know today when we think of Captain America.
Well, yeah, his series got canceled a couple of times.
Captain America Commie Smasher. I still want to read those.
Commie Smasher, you wish. They made it a horror comic book at the end.
Oh, well, that was before Commie Smasher. You're right. They what was it? Captain America's Haunted Tales? Is that what it was called?
There's Weird Tales. Yeah, the last couple issues. I have got some tinfoil hat theories for the end of the show, where I want to talk a little bit about the Atlas stuff. But just to get back to a couple things that George had mentioned, he was talking about sort of with Captain America sort of in each issue, some fans felt like it was getting a little tired. We were just talking about Bucky all the time, but you also talked, George, about a little bit about that speech in the Avengers movie, and both of those things sort of tie into something like I mentioned at the beginning. I think that the importance of Avengers 4 has gotten more and more. It's gotten more and more important as time has passed. The immediate importance, besides what we've talked about on a character level, I think was that it gave the center for the Avengers book. In issue 16, all the founding members of the Avengers leave, and we get the replacements come in. And, I've read a lot of talk about how Stan Lee did that in part because he was having trouble remembering what was happening with the characters in their own books, and it was hard to logistically to figure out this, Iron Man's doing this in this issue, and then how is he in this issue of Avengers? And that's fine, but I think Stan also realized on a story level that a big problem with Avengers was that nothing could actually happen to the characters. Because you couldn't have something major happen to Iron Man or Thor in Avengers. It had to happen in their own title. So it was really important to have Captain America as the center of the book. If you look at the first couple years of Avengers, we have that first 5-issue arc with the Hulk that concluded in Fantastic Four. But starting with issue 4, Captain America comes in. He becomes the only character in the team that can have stuff happen to them, that has the emotional events can take place. And the next sort of batch of issues, plot-wise, they're all over the place, but story-wise, what they're about is Captain America and Baron Zemo. So the story that runs from issue 6 to 15, where Baron Zemo dies. We get Baron Zemo introduced in 6, dies in 15. That's all about Captain America. The heart of the whole series is about Captain America. And then in 16, we get the other characters written out and new characters come in where story-wise we can also have stuff actually happen to Hawkeye and the Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver because Avengers is their title. I don't think it's a coincidence that when they bring those characters in is right around the same time that Captain America gets his own title over in Tales of Suspense, because now he has other people in Avengers, right? So Captain America becomes the center of the Avengers. He's the heart of the Avengers, and he's always, from that point on, is always the heart of the Avengers. But we also see as the years go by that Captain America becomes, I think, the heart, the moral center of the Marvel Universe. Anytime there's any kind of crossover events or team-ups or anything, it's Captain America is always at the center of it. He's always the leader. Even when they're like fighting the X-Men, you know, it's always the heroes versus the mutants, and it's Captain America on this side. Civil War, it's Captain America's on this side. And if they're all together, like fighting whatever, Onslaught or something, Captain America's the leader. He's the center of the Marvel Universe. And he's the center of the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Yeah.
In an era, both the 1960s and today, where it's hard to trust our elected leaders anymore and know who the good guys are, Captain America is that one centerpiece everyone can look to and trust inherently because he has demonstrated time and again he's willing to put his own interests aside for the greater good.
And I think that those character elements that we talked about earlier resonate with people, you know, post 9/11, post Iraq War, when he starts appearing in the Marvel Universe, like in 2010, right? It's important or interesting to note that like the key things that are the center of Avengers number 4 are still the key things that are the center of the character in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The fact that he's a man out of time, and he has this pathos, he doesn't recognize the world he's in, he doesn't understand what's happened to America, he's lost not just Bucky, but also Peggy Carter, and the fact that he's a man out of time, but also the loss of Bucky is like a major, not just character moment, but plot for the entire MCU, with the Winter Soldier driving several of the movie storylines. And so the death of Bucky and him being frozen and lost in time are sort of the cornerstones of the MCU, and his emotional arc for the first 20 movies is the emotional arc of the entire MCU, the biggest movie franchise in the history of the world.
Yes.
And it's all directly comes out of Avengers number 4.
And you know, it's interesting, I'm now thinking too, contrasting with another established superhero from DC, in a way Captain America is an answer to Superman, who was a character who was the central moral compass of DC Comics, you know, 1950s and on. But in a very simple, vapid, meaningless way, you know, he had lost an entire world. You know, there was a story there to tell, but it had never been done like that. And, you know, you talk about the most successful franchise of all time. Superman was the most dominant superhero franchise for many years. Superman was the icon, the hero. And now in, you know, the 2000s, when Marvel's trying to give us a hero to believe in again, DC's trying to make Superman dark and edgy and totally missing the freaking point.
They keep messing that up. But I say this, you're right about the Captain America. I'm just going to add this to what Scott said, that, yeah, it's true that Captain America got his own feature in I think, what was it, Tales of Suspense? But it was set in World War II. So they weren't yet giving him continuity to go with what he was doing. So that means that although he had a feature, it was set in World War II, that his real book was the Avengers. That's where everything was happening. That's where he wanted to, like you said, get revenge for Bucky on Zemo. And also after that, he wanted to join S.H.I.E.L.D. So everything's going on with that storyline with Captain America. At the same time, he has to try to train and control these 3 whippersnappers or whatever. So that I tell you, the Avengers book is just a great book. I mean, I love the first 16 also. I know there's some flaws, some Silver Age stuff, but it's just so much heart in it, and it goes all over the place. And again, Captain America, beyond issue 4, you see he's willing to take on the Avengers several times. There was one goofy story where I think I want to say Immortus, he kidnaps Bucky, and they tell him, Immortus tells Captain America, oh well, the Avengers set that up, and like Captain America goes back and he's gonna like beat up all the Avengers totally, and you almost believe he could do it again. So he's quite formidable, and people have so much respect for him. He became that book, it really was. You're right. It really, and he shined a lot more in that book to me than in his own stories.
One thing I want to go back and just mention about Avengers number 4 that we hadn't gotten to, and it's not the first book to do this, it's the second, but in the Marvel Universe, which was quickly discovering that one of its unique and distinct appeals was its interconnected shared universe, the importance of clearly choosing not to do an Earth 2 type situation. George, you referenced Flash 123 before. When Captain America shows up, it's the Captain America from the 1940s, but in this universe in a semi-logical way. There's an explanation that doesn't quite make sense, but at least here's an explanation beyond I've traveled between dimensions and multiple Earths to get here. And I think the reason that's so important is Avengers number 4 is also, in my mind, a very important do-over. I think the template for the Avengers number 4 story is Fantastic Four number 4, which is the introduction of Namor into the Silver Age, which essentially, if you look at the story of how they discover Namor and how he becomes Submariner again, it's almost the exact same story, where he'd been there all along in that universe, but unable to appear on his own and reclaim his mantle until our heroes get involved. And then immediately upon being reactivated and having people go, oh my gosh, you're the classic, Submariner character, immediately discovers a tragic revelation, experiences trauma. Oh my gosh, there's a character who's traumatic before Captain America. He sees what happened to his city, but, and this is really important, goes the other route. When Namor was traumatized, that was fuel for him to become a villain or at least an anti-hero. When Captain America is traumatized, he owns it and moves on. And that's an important contrast in my mind.
Well, I got a few things to say about that. First of all, I think some people call him Namor.
Is that what it is? I say every name wrong. Every name.
Some people,
I'm still embarrassed
about... call him what you want.
I'm still embarrassed about calling him Khazar last issue instead of Khazar. I'm going to learn it one day. It'll happen.
Well, in the Black Panther movie, they call him Namor. So.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, that Black Panther movie. Whatever.
Well, anyway, we'll have to ask. We'll ask Duke Pipper what he thinks about it.
We need a guide or something how to pronounce everybody's name. But anyway, I want to say
we need a fact checker. Go ahead.
I want to say one other thing about Namor. You said that Namor was always antagonistic towards the surface world from the very beginning. That never changed. So when he got his memory back, he was like, "Oh yeah, that's right. I hate all you guys, and I'm gonna kill you all."
But it's the discovery of what happened to his city that really sends him over the edge into a whole new level of being a villain.
One thing that I wanted to talk about, we haven't gotten into yet, is we've talked all about the importance of this issue in comics, in the its effects on the Marvel Universe. One thing that's interesting is to look at it like at the time, because they make a big deal on the cover and on the inside front cover about how this is fans have been clamoring for this long-awaited return of Captain America, and there's a few odd things about this.
Yes.
One is that, of course, it's not actually the first time that we've seen Captain America since his last series was canceled in the 50s, because they did this tryout book in Strange Tales 114 that also says, returning from the golden age of comics, it's Captain America, and then it turns out it's just some guy.
But don't they say at the end of it was a test to see whether or not fans would react?
I find that whole issue very weird. I have a whole tinfoil hat theory about this. I'm not sure if I should get into it yet. But
Put the hat on, man. Put the hat on.
Tinfoil hat theories.
Once again, I think you and I are going to overlap, Scott. Let's hear it.
well, to go back a little bit to the publishing history, so and to tie into what I was about to say this anyway, but one thing that's interesting is he hadn't been gone that long. Like after his series ended in the late 40s when it briefly became a horror comic, Stan and Alice tried to do a superhero revival in 1954. Actually started at the end of 53, went into 54. They brought back Captain America, they brought back the Human Torch, they brought back the Submariner, and those books ended in the summer of 54, which is terrible timing, because if they had waited just a year later is when DC introduced the new Flash and started the Silver Age, and they had the benefit of being post-code, where there was a lot less competition and all this stuff. So who knows if Atlas had just waited a year to try their superhero revival. But when you think about it, as a kid and reading those comics, it's always like, oh, Captain America had been gone for so long and finally he comes back. Well, it had actually only been 9.5 years since the Captain America 78 came out in 1954 to when this came out in 1964. So it wasn't even that long ago. Like, to put this in context, I know Shaxbury, you and I are both big fans of after the Life with Archie series. The issue where issue 37, the last issue there where he gets killed, where Archie dies, that came out 10 years ago.
Hold on, Archie's dead?
So, like, it's been longer between the last issue of Life with Archie and now than it was between Captain America's appearances when this came out. It really wasn't that long ago. Like, in Marvel terms, like, the crossover Original Sin came out 10 years ago.
Oh, God.
It feels like that just came out.
Can we let that one lie, please?
Well, I'm just trying to put this in context. Like, it really hadn't been that long since the character appeared, but also, like, here's the thing that I find very strange. Marvel, in Fantastic Four #1, we get this new version of the Human Torch. Just 3 issues later, in issue 4, they bring back Namor the Submariner. They've had a ton of success bringing back 2 of their 3 big Golden Age heroes. Why did it then take so long to bring Captain America back, and why did they feel the need to even have a tryout? So here's what my theory is on this.
Okay.
To go back to, like, the beginning of Captain America, Lee and Kirby working for Martin Goodman at Timely, they're doing Captain America. It's a massive hit. Stan Lee, as he proudly says on the front page of Avengers 4, his first published work was in Captain America #3. It was a text story in Captain America #3. Stan was basically an assistant. He was like a gopher at the office. He was assisting Simon and Kirby as they were making Captain America. The story that I've heard is that DC came to Simon and Kirby and was trying to poach them and give them a much bigger deal to come over to DC and take over a bunch of stuff. And supposedly, someone told Martin Goodman about this deal and he fired them. So their last issue of Captain America was #10. And at that point, they went over to DC. And Jack Kirby, my understanding is, has always believed that it was Stan who ratted them out to Martin Goodman and got them fired.
Yes, because he'd been asking to come out to lunches with them while they were planning this and saying, include me. You guys must be working on something big over there.
And Stan says it wasn't him. He denies it. But, so there's bad blood there to begin with. When Marvel revived Captain America at the end of 1953, going into 54, my understanding, what I've read, is that Simon and Kirby were not happy with that being revived. That's when they created their character Fighting American as a response to Captain America. And so, again, we have bad blood. We also have seen that when they did revive these characters, Bill Everett was fine with Namor being revived, and he came back to work at Marvel. But Carl Burgos was livid about what they did with the Human Torch, where they basically took the name and the look, but made a new character and just used him without his permission or anything, without his involvement. To the point where the story I read is he took all of his original art and all of his Human Torch, everything he had, and threw it out in his driveway and set it all on fire and destroyed it all in a fit of rage. And so here's what I think is happening, and I could be wrong, but I think there was some internal strife here, or potential internal strife. I don't know if it was real, or maybe Stan was worried about offending Jack or not. I don't know. But I think there was some kid gloves being used here. I have an idea in my head that Stan was doing the tryout book because he wanted to show Jack that the fans wanted the character back, to convince Jack to allow them to bring the character back. Because I think that Stan probably wanted to bring Captain America back, but he knew that Jack was pissed off about all these things and wanted to play it as carefully as he could before they brought it back, to avoid Jack Kirby getting angry about it. Now, that's just a theory. I don't really have anything to base that on, other than it doesn't make any sense to me that they would wait 3 years basically to bring Captain America back when they brought the other characters back and they were so successful with them. And
well, they did hold off on
history. Yeah, go ahead.
They did hold off on the Angel at first.
Well, I wouldn't put him quite in the same category, though.
No, I agree with that for sure. I'm sorry, keep going, Scott.
No, I mean, that was basically my theory.
I'm going to say it is. I find that interesting that you think that he was handling Jack Kirby with kid gloves, because I kind of just got the feeling that Jack Kirby just did whatever he was told to do, because that's where the money was.
Well, I'll tell you, it's actually interesting.
And he had no legal right to Captain America, right? Martin Goodman and Marvel owned it.
That's correct.
Yeah, but I mean, obviously this happened a little bit later, but we also see, Steve Ditko gets angry at Stan because of the way Stan's editing and writing Spider-Man, and he quits the company.
So
I mean, Kirby is
Jack Kirby could leave, but Jack Kirby had nowhere to go.
Well, yeah,
DC wouldn't hire him.
I think that again, I don't know exactly what was happening there, but I think the delay had something to do with the history. It just doesn't make sense to me. Like, it's a character you would expect them to bring back much sooner, I think.
I'll tell you, Scott, I picked up on similar things that you did and arrived at conclusions that are both the same as yours and the exact opposite of yours, which is interesting. I didn't really wonder why they brought back Captain America, why they waited so long, rather. In my mind, he was much less original. He was very derivative, and he was patriotic in a level where the context didn't seem to make sense anymore. Like, I could see why they held off on bringing him back, but I did question, I did call BS on Stan's repeated claims that the fans were demanding the return of this character. Not because it had been so recently that he'd been back in publication. My assumption is, the revival, I think, fell largely on deaf ears. I think a lot of people never saw it, never really noticed it. I think it was very easy to miss because Marvel wasn't the big deal it had been in 1941 when it first launched Captain America. I actually look at it as a reverse, that if you missed that revival in 1954, Captain America hadn't been in print for 15 years, which is too long for most average readers of Marvel to have been around for. Most of them were either in diapers or in the womb when the original Captain America run was still in print. So I cry foul and say something doesn't add up in that respect. Whereas you say it's too recent, I say it's too long ago. And I do think, I pick up on a similar vibe that I think there was... I think one thing Stan doesn't lie about is how symbolically important Captain America is to both of them on that first page. And I think it might have been... in addition to everything that you mentioned, Stan Lee had to fire his entire bullpen twice. He had made a lot of enemies and hurt a lot of people who'd worked with him. And here's this guy coming back to save his butt who was essentially running things back when Stan was a little assistant. And now the cerebrals have turned, and there's got to be tension there. You know, Kirby is not somebody who kowtows. I can't imagine that Kirby was treating Lee with reverence and, you know, whatever you want, boss man. There had to be a tension. And I saw this as Stan trying to placate and pay homage to Kirby and sort of essentially give him an opportunity to bring back this character that had been his as well, and sort of give him a reason to want to stay beyond the money. And I think Avengers number 4 is really the first great Marvel comic. I'm sure someone's going to say it's Spider-Man. But in my mind, this is the first really, really great Marvel comic. And I think you see Stan start putting more effort into both his art and his plotting after this point. I think he's more invested after this. And you could argue that Avengers number 4, in addition to redefining what a hero is to the world, and in all the things that, Scott, you talked about Captain America continuing to become a more and more important hero with time, I think it might have been that there wouldn't have been the legendary Lee-Kirby partnership we know about, lasting for as long and as impactfully as it did, if Avengers 4 hadn't happened.
I mean, but they were still had a big hit with the Fantastic Four, so they were still doing that.
Sure, but they were in the double digits. They were in, what, issue 25 by the time this came out? It had been a while. You know, so I if this was just a job for Kirby at this point, I don't have any reason to believe it was a passion project for him. You know, he might have just at a certain point left when the money got better somewhere else. I think this was an emotional investment for him, an emotional anchor that made him invest in this company more.
Well, that's a theory.
I'll take it.
Well, you mentioned, just to go back to the Stan Lee writing that story in Captain America 3. I read somewhere that Stan Lee was the very first person to include the shield being used as a object to be thrown and it returns back to him. So, in a way, he's co-creator of Captain America 2.
Oh boy, we get back into the creator attribution, huh?
I mean, I've mentioned this before, but there's nothing in comics that I'm less interested in than arguing over who did what. Having said that,
Jack Kirby created Wolverine.
There were moments reading this comic, Avengers 4, where I was like, oh, that feels like a Kirby thing. The part where it turns out the alien, because of his fuzzy long hairs on his head, his weird alien head, when seen in shadow, they think he's Medusa because he's turning people to stone, and he's the origin of the Medusa myth. I was reading that and I was like, that's Kirby. That's 100% Kirby. The other thing I wanted to mention, and I'm afraid I don't actually have the name of this book, but one of my tinfoil hat theories, I was doing a little research about the sort of man out of time, someone frozen in time. There's quite a few science fiction books really starting in the late 19th century, but in the first half of the 20th century that had similar sort of conceits. Someone frozen in time, they wake up in the future, etc. One of them, and I'm afraid I've lost my note on the name of the book or the author, but there was a book that came out in the 30s that was about someone that was basically frozen in suspended animation. They're woken up in the future, and the book ends with the man and all of humanity forming a collective hive mind. And I saw that and I thought to myself, wow, that sounds a lot like Eternals with the Unimind to me.
Oh, yeah.
And I wondered if that was maybe like percolating when they were deciding to have Captain America be sort of frozen in time, like that aspect of the story. I just wondered if that might be something that Kirby had brought to the table, because it just seemed like a little bit of a coincidence. But that's a real tinfoil hat theory. I have nothing really to base that on, other than it's clear reading this issue of Avengers that there are parts that are very clearly Kirby. There's other parts that I find interesting too. One thing we haven't talked about is how this scene in Avengers 4, well, there's two key scenes that have been referenced dozens or hundreds of times in comics, but also in TV and movies and everywhere. That's Captain America waking up with the Avengers surrounding him, thawing out of the ice. But more, the scene where Bucky dies, where he's on the flying bomb and it blows up and Bucky dies, that's been done over and over. And you read it so many times that you're like, you have it in your head, oh, here's where Baron Zemo blows up Bucky. So it's interesting when you read this that Baron Zemo's not in this issue because Baron Zemo doesn't even exist yet, because he doesn't first appear until issue 6. So it's almost like a little bit of a Mandela effect, where you're like, I always think of this as Zemo being in that scene, and what actually happens
they
is
just show his hand. They just show a hand. They don't show.
There's like a little silhouette of a guy in one panel.
Are you saying that Zemo wasn't even a character yet before this?
He was.
Yeah, his first appearance wasn't until issue 6, and I read issue 6 again when I was researching this. And here's where something, I couldn't quite tell if they had this all planned in advance or not. Part of me thinks that they left it vague who the bad guy was in issue 4 because they hadn't figured it out yet. In issue 6, when we're introduced to Zemo and we have the whole story with we get his backstory about how he got the mask stuck to him and all this stuff. But when he's talking about this, there's no mention of him. There's nothing in the artwork about Bucky or about like that scene. Instead, there's a couple lines of dialogue where he says he thought he had gotten rid of them, and there's a footnote saying it was in Avengers 4. And a part of me felt like that was something where this is a story Stan is doing. Because, again, you don't see who it is in issue 4, and then in issue 6, you don't see it either. It's just in Stan's dialogue and a little footnote and one line of dialogue that suggests he was the person in issue 4 that kills Bucky. So I wonder whether that was how much was intended and how much of that was sort of being pieced together on the fly.
That is interesting.
What's your theory that Kirby was writing Avengers also?
I mean,
I don't know. Did Stanley ever write a book?
I think. I think they wrote the stuff together. I think they had story meetings where they talked about what they wanted to happen, and then Kirby went and did the art. And then when Stan got the art, there were things that Kirby had put in that he wasn't expecting, and then there were things that when Stan was doing the dialogue that he put in that Kirby wasn't expecting him to do.
Yeah.
I think it was a collaboration.
Yeah.
But like, it's interesting. It's interesting to me to try and figure out who did what, but it's not important to me to figure it out.
I think Stan Lee created Wolverine.
That list keeps growing every week.
Yeah, well, who didn't create Wolverine? I think I might have.
Vince Coletta.
I don't remember. It's possible I did. So
Vince Coletta saved Marvel. Okay, so leave him alone.
That's a whole different podcast that I don't think I'm on that episode. Yeah.
You know, we recorded that one, but then I erased it. Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a cheap shot.
I mean, but speaking of other like sort of story ideas, like that sort of came out of 4, because 4, like that little scene, the scene with Bucky ends up setting up all this stuff with Zemo, whether it was intended or not. But the fact that they moved in that 20 years in time created a bunch of story opportunities because it totally messed up continuity, if anyone cared about continuity. I mean, most importantly and famously is that Steve Englehart then did the Captain America of the 1950s story. In 1972, he did that story where he was like, hey, if he was frozen in time, who was the commie smasher that appeared in 1954? And he did this absolute all-time classic story, which was, of course, a commentary about 1950s values versus the 1970s values. But it also created more continuity issues where they're like, well, yeah, that explains the 50s guy, but if Captain America went in the ice in 45, and his series didn't end until 49, who was in the costume in those post-war issues? And then they did more stories which were less interesting. You know, and then obviously all the stuff with Bucky being brought back was the Winter Soldier. Like, there's so many stories that sort of springboard out of these scenes from Avengers 4 that themselves later become really major, important stories in Marvel.
And don't forget,
Marvel,
too, that for
sorry,
a while, Stan and Jack were teasing the readers with potential crossovers between Captain America of that era and Sergeant Fury. And they did Sergeant Fury number 13, and then, at least from what I was able to glean from the letter columns, it seemed like the fans were asking them not to do that anymore. But maybe that was a direction they intended to explore more originally, you know, where that hand could have been Von Strucker or even the Hate Monger.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird. It sounds weird to people that have read Sergeant Fury because it seems like such an unrealistic war comic. But there were complaints that having Captain America in it made it feel a lot less grounded.
Yes.
And it also sort of like makes the Fury and the Commandos seem kind of pointless. If you've got Captain America, you know, and by extension, logically, the rest of the timely superheroes over there fighting in the war, I mean, Dum Dum Dugan looks pretty stupid in comparison to that. So, like,
He always did.
He looks like a dum-dum.
fair enough. Fair enough.
You know, I want to point out that, you know, that's interesting you're saying where a lot of stories springboard out of Avengers 4. One of my favorite stories, maybe my favorite two-part of all time, is Avengers 56 that leads into Avengers Annual number 2, where Captain America is bothered and wondering whether Bucky really died in that explosion. So they go to Dr. Doom's castle, they go in a time machine, and they go back to that period and want to see if he actually blew up. And they find out he actually did, but, you know, it leads to the next story because something happens and they get trapped in a parallel world and they take on the original Avengers. I found that so wonderful. And I really hate that, you know, I mean, look, I know Winter Soldier is a good story and made a movie and everything, but hey, Bucky was dead. Why bring him back 60 years later?
Because nobody stays dead in comic books.
Yeah, I guess. The whole thing about that book, all the visuals, them grabbing him out of the water like that, put him on the table. He has a tattered army uniform on top of himself. I mean, everything is just, you never forget those pages.
No, you
know?
don't.
And I remember some person said something silly that Jack Kirby wrote that page where he comes off the table and he takes on the Avengers. It's, oh, I didn't have any backgrounds. I'm like, you know, you're telling a master how to actually, like, highlight what's happening in that page. You know, you could clutter it up with backgrounds, or you could just have the central figures going at each other, and you actually, you know, and then that panel where Captain America's charging at Giant Man and Thor is like leaning over trying to catch the hammer, and Iron Man's in the back. That's just great panels and never to be repeated. Nobody does stuff like that now.
And I think it's important to remember, too, always when we discuss comic books as art, that they were also a business and there was a schedule. And Stan Lee was, not Stan Lee, whoa, my gosh, Jack Kirby. Oh, boy, never confuse the two. Jack Kirby was, you know, very, very overcommitted with the amount of work he was churning out for Marvel each month. And yet this issue is special. Like, you can tell he spent a lot more time on it. There are early issues of Marvel that I find the art utterly forgettable. But this one has, I actually went and counted. It has 7 images, 7 different panels, including the cover, that have been frozen in my memory since the first time I read this issue. I'm not really an art guy, but 7 panels that I will never forget. I could describe vividly from memory. They were so striking and so powerful. And one of them that we haven't talked about too much is when Cap first wakes up and shouts, "Bucky, Bucky, look out." That terrified, anguished face he gives. There's only one other time I can think of that Kirby made a face like that. And that was when Bruce Banner is hit by the gamma bomb. In both cases, you have the utter terror of a character on some instinctual level realizing something has been taken away from them, something has changed, and they will never again be the same.
Yeah, I mean, that's why the book is so revered. It's a masterpiece.
Absolutely.
Again, there's some silly Silver Age things, some coincidences that you say, okay, whatever. But again, the whole idea was as a vehicle to bring Captain America back as a different, more compelling figure, and they did it. I think they succeeded.
And created a character who, as Scott, you've pointed out, becomes more and more important to us as time goes on. So, Scott, thank you so very much once again for joining us. I know how busy your schedule is, and my gosh, you dropped 2 tinfoil bombs on us, so thank you so much for that knowledge.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Scott,
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for coming. When Jeff came up with the idea, I said, we have to get Scott to do this. Because there's only one other person I know who loves the Avengers like I do, and that's Scott. And he's going to have a lot to say about this. So,
well, I appreciate it.
Even though he mauled that Captain America 4 by putting glue on it.
Hey, that cover is still stuck to the spine. It is not. It's been almost 40 years, and that cover's not coming off. So it worked perfectly.
You know what? I did the same thing with staples. I have a couple of books that I did surgery on. I just stapled them together. Same thing. They're such bad shape. What's the difference?
Well, that should do it for today. Special thanks to Paul King for the Classic Comics Forum theme song. A massive special thanks to Scott Harris King, who's right here with us right now, for creating the original Classic Comics Forum podcast and coming back to join us on it today. Thanks for trusting us to take it to the weird new places we've taken it, Scott. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
It was special that you came, man.
And don't you dare be sad that the episode's over, because you can always head over to classiccomics.org to find far more in-depth discussion about these individual episodes, as well as a wealth of other conversations about classic comic books with some of the friendliest, most knowledgeable people on the World Wide Web, including Scott, by the way. So check us out at classiccomics.org. And hey, if even that's not enough for you, don't you dare forget that you have an opportunity to join the hidden, secret, our exclusive hangout on the World Wide Web within the Classic Comics Forum, where we give you all sorts of extra content, including deleted scenes, the original extended theme song to this show, weird images of George and I that I'm frankly embarrassed to be sharing with the community, lots of background trivia, and most importantly, our new weekly series, Off the Cuff, where George and I, and sometimes our guests, talk about comic-related things that are less planned, don't warrant a whole episode, but still drop a lot of knowledge and thought and invite conversation from you as well. You can access that section by joining patreon.com, the Classic Comics Forum. And of course, let's give a special thanks to our Patreon supporters who are doing that right now, enjoying those privileges and helping the CCF In Depth and the Classic Comics Forum with their financial contributions and their support. And that includes Bill Sinclair, Marty Golia, Michael Gallagher, Tim Schneider, and Berkeley. We appreciate you so much. Thanks for all you do for us and for this community. CCF In Depth is produced in partnership with the Classic Comics Forum, found at classiccomics.org and on Facebook. See you next time.
Comics Forum in depth, snappy conversations. Your host George and Jeff. Oh, classic comics, the Classic Comics Forum in depth. Talking about old comic books is the thing that they love.
ClassicComics.org.